Horror, and it is the 14th of September in 2022, and it's another day of Let's Go Brandon celebration here, where we're going to talk about all the things that are going on in the country and the reaction our president's had to it, and what's happening to our state. Um, Don Anderson is going to be trying to join us here. He's run into some technical difficulties. Apparently, maybe the NSA doesn't want him to get on there because he's way too dangerous a mind for them to allow to be present on our show. But he's going to fight through it and try to get that internet working on his end, and then we'll add him to the show here very shortly. So anyway, welcome everyone. And I'm going to go ahead and launch into it here. You know, I think a lot of you, and when Don comes on, I'm sure he'll be able to echo this. A lot of you probably remember the 1970s, right? And I think some of you probably feel like we're reliving the latter half of the 1970s right now, except that I think there's some differences. I think that we have a media that's uh, dramatically worse, literally cheerleading and covering up bad news and cheerleading complete nonsense. And so here's what's hitting Oregon right now. And these stories are, you might brush them off as one off stories, but then when you hear what they mean for all of us, you'd be like, aha, yeah, that does make sense, actually. And so turns out that Oregon officials have stated that they are going to only permit this year Oregon landlords to raise rents by up to 14.6%. Yeah, that's all. I'm sure all of you have 14.6% more money, and that's 5% above the allowed rent increase that was permissible this year. So next year's rent increase, uh, this year's is the ceiling is 9.9%, which is significant. Uh, but they're going to increase that by 5%. The allowable increase has to be pegged to, you got it, inflation. It's calculated annually by the Office of Economic Analysis using the Consumer Price Index, which Joe Biden's not worried about. We'll get to that in a second. It tracks the changing costs in hundreds of household items like food and medicine and gas, homes and cars. And so this is something that should get everyone's attention, because what happens when rent goes up because of inflation? Well, inflation goes up. Inflation goes up because inflation, then suddenly the cost of renting a place increases. Therefore, now you're effectively uh, poorer because you had the same amount of money, but now you get less for it. Or you better go find some money if you want to continue living in the place that you're in, if you happen to be a renter. We already know that last year, housing prices for purchasing homes was up by, in the Portland metro area, where I know it's a pretty intense market, it was up by, I think it was 26% in a year. Now, this alone can cause the economy to start to slow because people feel like they don't have as much money to spend. So they not only can't go as far on the money they've got, but they start conserving their money and saving it because they're concerned. And that is very logical. Now, this is where I get into the 1970s and talk about what this means. There's another news story here that I happen to see almost in the same breath, even though they're not related directly. But 1,100 timber workers are going on strike across Oregon and Washington. What's one of the main things they use timber for? Building new places to live. So we're going to see a strike because these guys are like, well, look, we should be getting paid more. And they're having an argument with like Weyerhaeuser, which is Washington and Oregon primarily. And this massive strike is going to hit. it's probably going to lead to more inflation, actually, if the pay increases happen, and therefore more increase in the cost of building dwellings, as well as everything else that's made out of wood. Does this sound familiar? Does anybody remember the 1970s? Remember all the strikes? Remember the trucker strike, the coal miner strike? And it was like strike, 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 strike. And of course, this stuff didn't end until we got a new president who, when the air traffic controllers, PATCO is the name of the union, decided to go on strike, President Ronald Reagan said, "We're done. This is it. My foot is down." And but really, I actually kind of understand with inflation going up that folks are trying to push for higher wages. This is the problem. If things that are based on the consumer price index cause other things to go up that then feed back into the consumer price index, and then people demand higher wages, you have what's known as a wage and price spiral. A wage and price spiral means that they both spiral out of control because one causes the other. And then eventually everybody expects there to be more inflation in the future, or certainly the same amount of inflation, which is a rate of increase. And therefore, they expect that they're going to have to demand more money in order to keep up with it, which causes the products, the goods and services that the businesses they work for, that those businesses process and sell, to become more expensive, which feeds into the consumer price index. So where does all this lead? It all leads to the same place it did in the 1970s, which is it's going to be a really, really ugly recession. It has to be. High interest rates are going to have to come back. And you know who knows this? The stock market knows this. Yesterday, it went down by 1,300 points. And I can tell you that even in the era of big ups and downs in the stock market, when the stock market goes down by 1,300 points, you're talking about a fair amount of losses that are taking place. And that's because they are concerned that they are going to start experiencing reduced business earnings and more interest rate increases. So, Don, I was just talking here about two things. There's a timber workers strike that's going to hit here in Oregon and Washington, and they are raising the cap, because in Oregon, according to law, you can't just raise the rent to whatever you want. You have to stay within certain percentage parameters that are determined by the Office of Economic Analysis using the Consumer Price Index. This year, it was permitted to go up by as much as 9.9%, so 10%. Next year, it's going to be 14.6%. And I was just walking through the wage and price spiral problem. You remember the 1970s, all the strikes, the coal miner strike and the trucker strike. And then we started seeing everybody expected inflation to continue, no matter what the government said, no matter what the government did. And therefore, you had to raise your prices because you had to pay your workers more, who then in turn went out and spent that money competing with other people getting increased wages, and inflation goes up. And actually, with strikes, you see the supply go down, right?
So right.
Wood go down. What do you think's going to happen to the price of wood?
Yeah, it'll go through the roof.
Yeah, it's going to go through the roof, assuming you can afford a roof at that point.
Exactly. Really.
So we're in a really pretty darn serious situation that looks like the 1970s. And that really ended with remember the 21% interest rates?
Oh, it was crazy.
And the incredible increases in the cost of living that came to a screeching halt when they basically had to shut the economy down as much as they could.
Well, you remember the old misery index, right? You know, double-digit interest rates, double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, right? And here we are, you know, I want to say happy days are here again. It's the reverse of that. And by the way, I didn't realize till I read that article that Oregon had statewide rent control.
Yeah. Under the law, you're limited in how much you can increase it by. So they don't dictate the rents themselves, but they dictate the rate at which you can increase it. And look, I understand that in certain circumstances for low income housing, that certainly makes sense. But then once they've unleashed all these inflationary pressures, that might not even be enough for the landlords to keep up with all the costs they're facing.
Yeah, well, you know what
and
it
the
does.
new higher interest rates they have to pay.
Rent control never works. I mean, wherever it's tried, it's a disaster, right? I mean, just got to be logical. You know, if you're a landlord, what are you going to do, right? So you just say, well, those costs got to recoup somewhere. So you stop keeping up the property, right? Things start going to hell. They turn into slumlords, is what happens. You know, and that's, or you get the under the table situation, which you have in places like Santa Monica, you know, where you don't charge the rent, but any people hold on to their properties forever because they want to keep that rent. And then they start trading into their friends and neighbors. So the stuff's never really on the market. And then nobody's building new stuff. I know several people in Portland who were landlords, and that's a place that is really difficult. Certain parts of town, well, all over the town, the rents are like outrageous. So what happens is people who are in that business are getting out of it because they have no control over the price or the costs. And so that causes a shortage, which drives the rent up for the remaining people, and you just don't have any place to live in those places. And that's what's going to happen in Portland. That is happening in Portland.
Yeah, it is. And Bobby points out here that the ding-dongs in DC are partying with our money. Well, they're actually even printing more of it and then pretending it's their money and infusing it into this marketplace. So they're actually making the problem worse. They aren't even reducing inflation, but they just passed an Inflation Reduction Act and they're all celebrating while the stock market was dropping 1,300 points for the day on bad inflation news. They were having a big fiesta on the front lawn of the White House where Joe Biden was signing things and Nancy Pelosi was declaring that she's super awesome and they're all super awesome and that the Inflation Reduction Act is named perfectly. That's literally what she said, even though literally the liberal media, the media that is a shill for them, can't even with a straight face anymore say that it does anything to reduce inflation at all.
Well, whatever they name the legislation, that's how you know it's the opposite. You know, whatever they call it, it's doing the opposite, pretty much.
That's right. Yeah, it's bizarro, backwards, upside down land, and but like I said, the media at this point doesn't seem to be able to stomach it because they do stand to lose in all of their credibility, even with the people that would tend to support Joe Biden. It's just like, yeah, but those people are like, well, no, there is inflation. And so Joe Biden's, his response to what happened with the stock market dropping, saying, are you concerned about it? He goes, no, I'm not concerned about inflation. I'm not even concerned about the economy. It's all doing super awesome. He claimed that there was just this tiny increase in inflation, but then he just sort of buried the fact that the annualized rate is 8.1%, which is significant. And anybody who's kind of dabbled in economics enough to understand at least what interest rates have to do is that when interest rates are below inflation, then if you're, say, getting 5% interest on your money, which is actually way more than you can get right now, still, but if you're getting 5% on your money, but inflation's 8%, then you are shrinking by 3%. Despite the fact that you've invested your money, you have to actually earn more than inflation just to not lose money. And then, of course, if you want to attract capital, if you're a company or a bank or somebody and you want to say, well, come invest your money with me, you can't say, we'll help you match the rate of inflation. That's not a very interesting investment prospect, which means that if the inflation rate's 8.1%, interest rates have to be higher than that. That's how we got 21% interest rates back in 1979, 1980, right?
Right. And then you simultaneously do things that really hurt supply chain, like look at all the layoffs they caused with their COVID scare. So how many people lost their jobs? How many professions are short, really short? Like you look at the medical profession, it's really underwater. And there's people who are waiting for months and months and months to see a physician or get a procedure done because they forced people out of that business. Same with the airlines.
Yeah.
They forced people out of those businesses. And so now I don't fly anymore, but the delays, I understand, are just legendary.
Oh, cancellations. I had a flight back in May, and I literally got notice at 11 a.m. that my flight that was supposed to leave at 6 from DC back to Portland was canceled. That's it. Go find another flight. But Don, you're not allowed to think that this might have something to do with all of the pilots and flight attendants they had to fire who didn't want to comply with the vaccine mandate.
Oh, no.
Remember the vaccine and how that stopped the spread? No, great. Just super job. Right?
Yeah. Stop the spread of travel. That's what it did.
It's stopping the spread of prosperity, and it's stopping the supply of goods and services. And so they're literally doing everything they can to make it worse. And then when they make things more expensive, you know what they do? They go and they come up with a government program to print more money to send it out to people, which just fuels the same inflation that is causing people to not. You can't. This is why amazingly stupid things like what happened in the Weimar Republic in Germany, where they literally had to take buckets full of money to go buy a loaf of bread. Yeah. Wheelbarrows full of money actually is what it was, and they have pictures of people doing that just to keep up with like surviving each day. And that is, inflation is not it's not something that's caused it's not like a natural disaster. It's not like a hurricane coming on shore and you just couldn't do anything about it, so you just got to be prepared for it. It's a man-caused disaster.
And the thing is you could argue that in the 30s and back then they didn't know. Now we know what causes inflation, and we know everything they're doing. We know, which makes you think that it's strategic on some level, because it's just impossible to not know this kind of stuff, to not know that rent control never works. By now, it's been tried everywhere, all over the world. It's a disaster every time, but we do it anyway.
Yeah, they say we don't care how much. We don't care what supply and demand is. Here's how much it costs. And by the way, here's a bunch of money we printed. Okay. So, but here's the thing. So what happens when it's that bad and the people running the country are that stupid? What do? Well, at some point they just have to pretend that reality is something else and lie. Well, the liberal media, the Washington Post, or as Mark Levin calls it, the Washington Compost, they have actually fact-checked Joe Biden in his speech yesterday, where he went and claimed that he has the strongest record of growing manufacturing jobs in modern history. And he got 2 Pinocchios for this from the Washington Compost, because they said that this is clearly misleading. He was comparing a 19-month period to periods of time when people had been in office for 4 and 8 years previously, and just claiming he's doing super awesome. And the thing is, he has to claim it now because the Biden recession that's brought on by Biden inflation is absolutely going to change his job creation record, unfortunately, for us. I don't really care about his political prospects. I think politically he's dead. He's done, right? There's nobody in his own party that wants to see him be the nominee. They just don't want to talk about who it might be instead because things are so bad. They want him to be the guy, the captain that's on the bridge of the SS Biden-tanic, and it's just going down like and you want to see his go under the water, and it's like, okay, let's run someone else.
Yeah, well, that's the strategy.
He's at the bottom of the Atlantic now.
That's got to be the strategy, to hang it on him rather than the party. When the reality is the party that put him there, and they deserve all the credit, if you want to call it that, associated with the disaster that they caused. I mean, there's not a single thing that you can name. I challenge and defy anyone to name a single thing that they've done that's been positive, since he's been in office. is probably the worst run for a president, certainly that I can think of in my lifetime. Whether you're talking the disaster in Afghanistan, whether you're talking the interest rates, you're talking the economy, crime, the border. I mean, you can hardly think of an administration that's been worse than this one. And as bad as this sounds, these lies are so blatant that you go to the supermarket and he's lying. You go to try to find a used car, he's lying, right? You can't find a used car.
Lori here has a really good. She said Biden's a quarterback who's running the wrong direction. It's like there's his blockers and he's running the other way and he just gets creamed and tackled for a loss. The thing is, they haven't admitted that maybe he cognitively he doesn't even know it. Like he gets back into the huddle and say, "Let's run that play again." And so we're in an interesting time now. Speaking of people that just don't seem to be able to face the truth or take any accountability for what's happening. Back here in Oregon, we have a candidate for governor who's, to put it mildly, taken some hits today. This is the no party candidate for governor, Betsy Johnson, who actually is a Democrat, or she was for 20 years. And then suddenly she just, changed, went into a computer and updated her registration. But here's the thing. I think she took some hits because there's a very interesting article here. First of all, it's been revealed because she waited until the very last minute to reveal how in Oregon, you have to report all your expenditures and your contributions. But you have up to a certain point, you have like 30 days to report it. And as you get closer to election time, you have to do it within 7 days. Well, they waited to the absolute last second to report this because, as it turns out, they spent nearly $1 million to gather 23,744 valid voter signatures to put her name on the ballot. Well, I can tell you, spending $1 million to do that, they even took an example of a proposed constitutional amendment that has been put on the ballot here by a group. They got 149,360 signatures, and they spent $1.6 million. So they got, what is that? Let's do the math. 5 times the number of signatures, spending only a third more money. And that might suggest, first of all, that they don't really have a great campaign operation, that there isn't a big grassroots swell of support for her that they were trying to pretend there is. And then they spent $1 million, which $1 million in an Oregon gubernatorial campaign, that's a lot. They ended up turning in about 37,700 signatures. But I know from the Recall Kate Brown efforts, far less than the amount of money she spent was spent on those campaigns. I think it was maybe less than 100,000. It was probably like 60, 70,000. I have to check that, but they gathered in the 2020 signature gathering effort, they gathered 280,000 signatures. 280,000, which means that what she is she's kind of this, like I refer to, this fictional character that has lots of money, and then they're trying to turn this into a real person running for office. And I think that the other thing I came across, which really stood out to me, was a letter or an editorial that was printed in the Newport News Times, and it said, "No thanks, Betsy." It's very short but sweet. He says, you can often take measure of politicians by paying attention to how little some of them actually say. The Betsy Johnson campaign has been notable in that regard. Rarely has an independent had so much money, so saturated the extremely expensive media market, and yet said so remarkably little where she stands. Yeah. She poses as a no-nonsense, ordinary Oregonian can-do type who will get things done, which she actually hasn't done for 20 years, because look at all the problems we got when she was part of the majority party. Railing against politicians creates a false impression that she is independent and new to the game. It's all misleading at best. And they kind of go on there to this article actually is probably trying to help Tina Kotek, but it strikes upon a real grain of truth here, which is that I think she is just somebody who says stuff, but she's not somebody who has a record of having done anything. Certainly not done anything about the problems facing the state when she had more power and influence than any Republican did. She didn't do anything about it, and now people are calling her out for this, and she's just a big bag of money. That's what she is.
Oh, she's posing as a centrist when nothing she's historically done would support that. And any objective analysis of it that's going to come out.
Yes. Well, and Christine Drazan actually, there was the Statesman Journal did a story about what would be the biggest problem in state government right now and how would you fix it. And Tina Kotek basically started saying, well, we need to hold all levels of government accountable for delivering the promises they make, which she didn't do for 10 years as speaker, because we saw time and time again, they didn't hold hearings. They didn't ask questions. They didn't even want to know. And then when COVID was going on and they had all these restrictions going, they didn't want to even ask the people in charge of making these decisions, how are you making these decisions? We want to hold you. She didn't want to hold them accountable. She didn't care. So she goes on, blah, blah, blah. We're going to help people suffering, blah, blah, blah. Leadership, blah, blah, blah. And then Betsy Johnson comes in and does exactly what that person who wrote that letter to the editor said, which is, attacks the two-party system of which she was part of for 20 years, claims everybody else is an extremist while not stating her position. And then she, after stating a bunch of these vacuous platitudes that don't actually say what she's going to do, she goes after the people that she spent 20 years supporting and helping for producing failure, and that she's the symbol of change. And then Christine Drazan responded, and I thought this was really good. She goes, I find it ironic that my two opponents are suddenly extraordinarily critical of our state government. This is extreme power for the past decade. If they felt like things are broken, why didn't they do something about it? We need to rebuild our state agencies from the ground up. I will fire Kate Brown's agency heads and appoint leadership that shares my commitment to customer service, transparency, and accountability to the people of Oregon. Boom, mic drop. I thought that was powerful. And it really shows people that if you want things, if things are not the way you think they should be, if it's on the wrong track and you want a big change, Christine's the big change. And the other two are just saying stuff, but they don't have any history or real intent to do anything about it.
And it's really simple. I mean, think about any company. I'll use sports. The sports analogy is probably best. If you've been the head of a football team and you've had a losing record, 3, 5, 6, you rarely get that many years, you're gone. And they bring another coach in with another philosophy, and he brings his team with him, or she brings, and then they see if that one can work out. There's not a whole lot of need for analysis. If you're 3-9 every year, you're probably going to be out of a job. And if you look at this state government, the Democrats have had power for what? Is it 20 years in a row now? I mean,
they've had the governor's mansion since '87, and they've had control of the legislature for about 20 years. Yeah.
So you look at that. So how much more analysis do you need? I mean, you drive the streets of Portland, right? You look at the condition of the state. Pretty much every indicator you can look at is in the toilet, and it's been under their direction. Both of those two candidates. So this is pretty easy if you're Drazan.
Yeah. And I think here's how you can put the lie to this too. Our next story is really interesting and normally something everybody would miss. So the Occupational Safety and Health Administration here in the state of Oregon, the same entity that was going and terrorizing businesses who didn't go and force people to wear masks everywhere in their stores and then gave them fines. Those sweethearts they have actually had to go and issue workplace safety violation citations, 3 of them, to the Oregon State Hospital. Well, guess who oversees the Oregon State Hospital?
Themselves.
The Oregon Health Authority, the same ones who gave the health and safety standards to OSHA to go enforce against people everywhere. And this says everything. And of course, where was Betsy Johnson screaming at the top of her voice a year or 2 ago at this moron? Oregon Health Authority Director Patrick Allen. Does that name sound familiar? The guy who is telling everybody how to run their lives, what stores could be open, whose jobs were essential, what schools could be safe or not safe and be open to kids. This guy said in a statement, because apparently this involved violence and injuries at the Oregon State Hospital in the psychiatric facility, which you got to believe is pretty loaded up with folks right now. If you've seen what's been happening in Portland.
Yeah.
And he goes, he said in a statement that any violence towards employees is unacceptable. The agency is working hard to reduce rates of workplace violence. He says, quote, "We must do better and we will do better," unquote. "We appreciate that the Oregon OSHA violations bring to light what they bring to light, and we will continue to partner with our hospital staff to find additional ways to prevent workplace violence." I mean, with the violence and the crime going on in Portland, I think this is just a natural outgrowth of it. But this is the guy who's in charge of the place. Why isn't his ass not being fired now?
Oh, yeah.
Now.
Yeah. And did you hear the platitudes, right? Did you hear a single definitive action that was going to be taken? In that, yeah, it's just stuff. So what specifically are you going to do to reduce that? They never get.
So in this article, to be fair, they do state a couple of things they're going to do. I'll just tell you what they are, but tell me if this sounds like mealy-mouthed garbage. The hospital has hired a violence prevention consultant because apparently they don't know anything about violence or prevention. And they are using a new assessment tool to help identify patients who may be more prone to violence. The ones that are coming from the city full of violence right now, that they don't seem to be able to figure out who should be in jail or not to begin with. And then staffing shortages, which they have caused. And they admit that part of this is due to COVID-related restrictions. I mean, they're literally they're the problem and they're the exacerbation of the problem. And they say they're the solution all at the same time.
Look, if you're interested in reducing violence and I don't hear the word increase prisons, I know you're not serious. If I don't hear the word increase the number of police, then I know you're not serious, right? That's just part of it. Now, if you want to talk about helping the people out once you got them off the streets, that's great. We definitely want to do that. But the first and foremost thing that they're supposed to do is protect the public. That is the number one thing that
the top job.
Government is supposed to do.
But there's no way to say that these guys are competent. And so you'd think that Kate Brown, who doesn't apparently want to solve any problems anymore because she's heading for the door and she's the least popular governor in the United States, you'd think even she could be shamed into firing this guy and say, we're gonna clean house.
There's no shame.
And instead it's like, no, nobody loses their job. They just say, thank you for bringing it to light. We'll get back with you later after our consultant tells us how to do everything we should already know how to do. And there were some great statements here in the feed. Bobby Richardson rightly asked, was Pat Allen sober when he said that? Because we know the story of what happened with him last year. And the thing is, I can't answer that. But I also fear that the answer is yes, he is sober, which just tells you how bad that is. Because it sounds like something that someone who isn't sober would say. And so I just wanted to bring that forward because how does this guy keep his job? Because people haven't yet voted for what they should this fall, which is complete change in how these things are being. I read a quote from Christine Drazan. Do you think this guy's got a ghost of a chance of holding on to his job? Hell no. Yeah. No. So did Betsy say she's going to fire this guy? No. When she was in the majority party, did she demand a hearing of the committees that she sat on or presided over? No. So that's it. We're done.
She said it, would you believe her anyway? If she said it now,
I know. Election year conversions. Oh, and so here's the thing. There's a little bit of cleanup on aisle 10 here that we have to do. But we thankfully have what's called the Oregon Moms Union. It was a group that was formed during the earlier part of this year by Mackenzie Pulliam, who's the wife of Stan Pulliam. She's the president and co-founder of it. And she's still working hard away. Stan's not the nominee, but look, it does matter that people stay in the fight and fight for the things that are right. And they are circulating a petition that's going to go to the Oregon Health Authority to repeal an Oregon Administrative Rule 333-019-1030. It's a rule that is causing public education staffing shortages to be far worse because they ban qualified teachers, staff, and volunteer parents from classrooms for not being vaccinated. Well, we just talked about how extremely effective the vaccine has been at stopping the spread. But they still have this rule. And she correctly cites here, she says, the CDC guidance has changed since this rule was implemented. And they no longer differentiate between vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals. Parents are asking why this outdated rule is still in effect when we need to prioritize getting teachers the support they need and giving parents the ability to get back in the classroom to get our kids caught up. So this is a government-inflicted problem on the government that is causing kids to be unable to have sufficient teachers in the classroom.
And when you see that sort of thing, you got to ask yourself the question, who's getting paid for this? I mean, that is so illogical that you have to wonder if they're being paid by getting more of these vaccines out.
And I know who's being betrayed, which is the kids. But this is brought to you by the same people who could pile on, 8 and 10% increases before inflation was spiraling out of control on education spending and produce worse results every year. Down near the bottom of the nation, they would produce high school graduation rates that were lurking in the 48, 49, or 50th place in the nation. And they kept increasing the amount of money they were spending. So I guess we shouldn't be terribly shocked that these guys are functioning this way. But I put a link in the feed here for everyone to go read this article if they want to sign the petition. OregonMomsUnion.com. Sorry, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, you could also focus on teaching the 3 R's instead of the other garbage you're teaching.
Yes.
So this money is not the issue.
No, it's what it's being spent on. Well, why don't we just hit this last topic here, because I think everybody knows we talk about it a lot, and we got off to a late start here with our technical problems, but I think the nation has a crime problem, and it's starting to become more apparent that leaders are pointing this out. And we've got people that are claiming that there's really nothing going on, nothing to see here. It's just like the old Police Academy movies where, there's, or actually, what was it? Animal House. And they're saying nothing to see here. Move along. And they get run over. There's fire in the background. Nothing to see here. Senator Blackburn from Tennessee has just come out and said, look, crime is out of control and communities are not safe, period. And this is a national problem now. We're going to talk about the Oregon dimension here in a second, but she kind of digs into this and says, look, it's pretty obvious. People are really concerned about the places they live and whether or not it's safe anymore. And, a lot of places that seem to have the strictest gun laws seem to have the most gun violence. And they don't seem to have a lot of will to arrest people or prosecute them, even for the gun laws that they said we had to have.
Well, let's face it. And that correlation is which geographies are most likely to have really strict gun laws? They're run by who?
Blue cities and states.
Who also are anti-police.
Yeah, and I think the criminals are winning, actually, because they're starting to introduce things like no cash bail, which means essentially no bail. The criminals are kind of being coddled, and this is really, we're going to see some states produce some results that I don't know if anybody was expecting. Illinois, is a great example. They're likening this now to The Purge. You've heard of those movies where the premise of the movie is for a day, for 24 hours, you can commit whatever crime you want, and no one gets arrested. And you get it out of your system, supposedly, and you go back to being a law-abiding society after all the murder and mayhem and crime. And I guess you spend the rest of the year cleaning up or something, and going to funerals, I suppose. And then, but they're starting to compare what is going to hit like Illinois and particularly Chicago. It's like the leading edge of a category 5 hurricane of just crime that's going to stream out into the streets in a place that already has dozens and dozens of shootings every weekend. And they're going to abolish it for nearly every offense: second-degree murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, drug-induced homicide, threatening a public official, aggravated DUI are just some examples of the crimes that will no longer have any kind of bail. Can you believe it?
See, you listen at that, and I have a difficult time believing that anybody's that stupid to not think what the result of that would be, which is even scarier. I'd rather that they were that stupid, because then you have to realize it's on purpose to create a disaster. I lived in LA when the riots happened there, and I can tell you, I felt more safe in LA when the riots were going on than I feel walking around Portland. Because at least in LA, you could call law enforcement and expect a response, and law enforcement was still trying to do their job. In Portland, they're just not. I'm not blaming the police. There's not enough of them, number one. And number two, what are they supposed to do? I mean, if you do anything, you're going to get pilloried. So you have police who are just trying to make it to the next day without having their livelihoods or their lives taken, knowing that the city doesn't have their back, the city government's against them, and the poor citizens. You've seen some of these neighborhoods where these homeless encampments are all over their streets. Imagine you've worked your rear end off to buy a house, put all your biggest purchase you're ever going to make, and now you got a homeless encampment in your block, which has made your house worthless, and you are stuck. And there's people going to the bathroom in your front yard. There's needles on your sidewalk. Your kids can't go out and play. This is not just a few places where this is happening in Portland. It's all over the place. And I tell you, I've been through some. I was in some pretty rough neighborhoods when I lived in Los Angeles, and none of them felt like that. I mean, if you call them, they would come.
Well, and one dynamic I was talking to somebody about yesterday is if it's not unusual for like a whole section of town to only have about 12.5 police officers is providing the entire on the ground force that, and patrol cars and so on, to respond to anything. And if a homicide happens, they don't send 2 cops to go investigate because they need people to protect the cops and to control the crime scene. Or if there's a major car accident or something like that, they have to send about 8 of them, is what they told me. If you have 12.5, like say 16, right, is the number that you have, and you send 8 of them to one crime scene, then the entire rest of that section of town has 8 police officers for every other thing that happens. So when there's a burglary and nobody's actually being actively shot or threatened with violence, imminent, then of course they don't show up. And of course, why would anybody respond to a catalytic converter theft when there's 8 people left for the entire section of town? And the national media is actually starting to detail what a specific example Oregon and of course Portland at the top of that list is. They are starting to tell people the story of what happened in Portland, that crime has surged, that city commissioners actually did pass a resolution to fight climate change by 2030, but then they defunded the police. And when they did that, and then of course they didn't have the police that were still there, they didn't have their backs. One of the city councilors actually accused them of lighting all the fires in town that were being lit by Antifa. And they won't point a finger at the criminals and the gangs actually that are involved with the homicides. You really have a a situation that is it's spun out of control, but it's also the example for the rest of the country. And this article refers to a Wall Street Journal article that actually draws this out in more detail. And not everybody has access to the Wall Street Journal, but they're finding it very hard to cut the rate of crime now. They just don't seem to have a way to do it because it's like a genie that's gotten out of the bottle and they can't put it back in. But it's not just Portland.
Well,
Sheriff is the same thing. He's like, they take Oregon has taken the dangerous step that requires law enforcement to arrest, book, and then immediately release suspects that have committed some misdemeanor and felony crimes. And this is kind of like poured fuel on the fire of crime in the state.
It's a perfect example of it's liberalism. Is like their children. So the thing that you're hired to do and that you can control, these local issues, you spend all your energy and resources on something you have like virtually no control over, which is the climate. I mean, how can a municipality impact the entire planet? It's insane. In the meantime, that Rome is burning right here. It's just unbelievable. And this is the mindset of children. And this crime thing spills out into ways you can't really see. I mean, for example, I drive through Portland periodically, and you see now people racing on the freeway. I'm not sure if you've seen this, Kevin, right?
Oh,
they'll blow by you 90 to 100 miles an hour. It used to be that you drive through certain parts of town on the freeways, and you'd always see a cop or two on the side or somebody get a ticket once in a while. I can't tell you the last time I've seen somebody get pulled over or I've seen a ticket. But I'm not even there that much, and I see car races all the time. Now, you know that eventually those things are going to result in some the potential for disaster is high when somebody's passing you at 90 miles an hour on an urban freeway during rush hour.
I know of a specific example of this. A teammate of my son's and a soccer team was just driving back from, I think it was from a game that they'd all just been at. And while he was on I-84 on the way home, some car came along and was traveling at about 100 miles an hour and hit him along, I think, the side and the front of the vehicle. He was okay. The vehicle did its job to protect him, but it was totaled. All the airbags went off. He had to come to a stop. And on I-84, there's traffic all around you. It's not very safe to be have to stop on I-84 because of an accident. And the person that did this, nothing. I mean, there's a wrecked car driving around someplace, but they just took off. They didn't stay. And they were going 100 miles an hour is what the estimate of, based on the analysis of the crime scene from the police officers that did respond. And so this is real, and this is happening all the time. And it's like the purge. We already have it here. So Illinois is going to be a bigger scale version of that. But I'll tell you, there's one other thing that's kind of even worse here, because we all think, well, okay, they're not doing enough about crime, and there's a lot of crime, and eventually they're going to get a handle on it. But there's a group called Antifa, which is actually in favor of crime, and they actually use violence to make their point and to intimidate people. And they took a police officer and put his family's home address in a press release they did on social media, telling people where this guy lives. And I guess there was some damage to a vehicle. They threatened him, and they stated bluntly that, if you thought we would forget two of their Antifa members who, then you were wrong. They said, quote, "See you soon," unquote, to this cop. So the police, this is just like a dystopian novel where the police are being threatened by a criminal gang that kind of can do what they want. And guess what? The state legislature passed a law making it a more severe criminal penalty if you dox somebody. That's what this is called, is where you report where they live, details of their family, and so on. And it's supposedly a more severe crime now. But who's going to enforce the law against
They're not going to enforce it, right?
No. You know why they passed it though? They passed it because they didn't think it was going to be a good thing to have Antifa. They did it to stop Andy Ngo from telling people who the members of Antifa are that are getting arrested.
That's okay.
So the law to protect Antifa, that Antifa is violating to threaten a cop, isn't going to be enforced against Antifa. So we got a bigger problem than just a lot of crime. We got people that don't enforce the laws, equal justice under the law, and allow some people to just literally be legalized terrorists in our society.
Yeah, that's not going to change till the leadership changes. I mean, all of it. And we got an opportunity this November to make that change.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. We got to change who's in charge. We got to send a huge message. Like if anybody you know just hasn't been voting, show them this episode and say, if you vote, you can change all this. And if you don't do anything, then you can expect it to get worse.
Yeah.
What message are you sending to the people who made these decisions that allowed all this to happen, or actually tried to make it happen? Well, you're saying do more of it if you don't stop who's running the society right now. So,
well, it's rough, because people can't see the running of people. They told us that they were going to do this. It's not like this was a secret. These people who are running this government right now said this is what they're going to do, and they did it. And some people,
it's not a bug; it's a feature, right?
Exactly. So people are finding out the hard way, but that's okay. I mean, now that we know the result, you have no excuse. It's not a theory. We know what they will do to us. You want more or less, and you have an opportunity this November to change it.
Well said, Don. Well said. That's a good note to end on. Thank you for joining me here tonight. I'm glad we got all the technical stuff worked out. I know we went on a bit longer, but we also delivered some pretty important information to folks and some perspective, which, as everyone knows that watches this show, you can't get anywhere else in Oregon. So thank you again for joining me.
Appreciate the patience too. I'm really glad to be able to get on.
We roll with the punches here. That's how we do it. Just like everybody out there who's dealing with Portland and Democrats and crime and inflation, we're all rolling with the punches right now. But let's make sure we do our job here in the election. And please, all of you watching this, please do your job, if you don't mind me saying, by sharing this with others. It's not enough for you to see this and say, "Oh, that's good." You need at least a dozen other people that need to hear this. Could benefit from this, maybe aren't even sure, like, oh, I don't know, I think Betsy would be fine. Okay, well, watch this episode and listen to what we quote from the articles. We don't just opinionate idly. So you can check it out and we back it up, and then maybe we can make the kind of change that we really need to have this fall by bringing everybody on board with us. So please share it with everyone you can. We're on YouTube. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. We're going to add more social media avenues as we go forward here. And you should be able to share that with anybody you know who can watch this. So thank you again. And we will see you guys tomorrow. No, not tomorrow. Today is Wednesday, right? So we don't do a Thursday show, but we will see you on Friday. I think that show will probably be myself and David Darnell. And we will see Don next Wednesday, hopefully, on the next episode of the Wednesday Captive Audience. So
I'll be
good night, everyone. And we will see you on Friday. Have a good one.